So good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Yitzi David. I am what they call the third musketeer, Rabbi Farachi, Rabbi Levi, and myself. So obviously, the series is called Legacy of Leaders. We'd like to go through some of obviously all characters in Tanakh are important, but some that we find in the Torah that really paved the way to create what is and now has become the Jewish people. So we're going to start the next couple of weeks going through the actual patriarchs, the Avot, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But before we start perhaps analysing the characters of each of them, I think we need to start with a fundamental question. It's so fundamental that Rashi, the medieval commentator on the Torah over 1,000 years ago, the first Rashi, in fact, in all of Torah, asks a very important question. The first question is his opening remarks and commentary to the whole of the Torah. And he asks, why on earth does the Torah start from here? Ask anyone in the street and you ask them, what is the Torah? What is the Bible? What is the Chumash? And they'll tell you, a book of laws, a book of mitzvot, Torah Chaim, it's there how to tell you to live your lives. So Rashi asks, if it's a book of mitzvot, start with the first commandment that was given to the Jewish people as a people, which is much later on. Forget the whole book of Bereshit, of Genesis. Start with Exodus, Shemot, Parshat Bo, and the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. The mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, sanctifying the new moon. That was before the Jewish people left Egypt, the first commandment they were given as an as a Jewish people. So Rashi is bothered. Why do we need the whole of Sefer Bereshit? And don't get me wrong, it makes light work for the kindergarten and reception teachers. They can make wonderful little pictures in kindergarten of Noah and his ark, and Avraham and his tent. Conveniently miss out the Akedah part, sacrificing a son, not really what you want to teach the 3-year-olds. But obviously the Torah is not there just for cute stories. And it's not, in case anyone was going to say, it's not a history book either. Rashi points out that in Muqdam u'Mu'achar Torah, that the Torah is not even in chronological order. At certain points, certain parts of history are written in the Torah before it happened. So it's not a history book, and it's not a book of mitzvot. So what is it? So Rashi gives his answer, something that almost prophetic. Rashi tells us over 1,000 years ago that the reason why we need to start from the creation of the world and the creation of man is because he says there will come a time where people claim that the Jewish people stole the land of Israel. This is over 1,000 years ago, Rashi speaking. He says it's so important for us to know who created the world. God created the world. Who created the Jewish people? Who created the land of Israel? And who decided that Avram Avinu should be given the land of Israel and his descendants, and etc., etc. But I want to take a slightly different approach. Rav Dessler points out something amazing. Rav Dessler says the reason why these stories in the Torah of the characters of Avraham and Sarah and Yitzchak and Rivka, says the reason why we need to know about these people and their stories is because this part of the Torah, Sefer Bereshit, is creating the spiritual DNA of the Jewish people. Which means, yes, we need to know how we formed as an as a people, and how we ended up in Egypt, and how we came out of Egypt and we received the Torah. But more than that, we need to know who are we as a people. We are Am Yisrael, we are Klal Yisrael, we are the Jewish people. But to know who you are, we need to know where we came from. And we came from Avraham and Sarah, and Yitzchak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Rachel and Leah, and all the Shvatim, the 12 tribes. And each of those individuals gave something unbelievable to the Jewish people as a nation. So as we go through each of these personalities, we're going to try and point out certain midot, certain attributes they possessed. And to know that this is an attribute, this is a character trait, not that just was a nice story to be told about Abraham, our forefather, but if it existed within Avraham Avinu and he earned it and he achieved it, then it exists within every single one of us. So we're going to try and analyze the Jewish people. We're told that each of the Avot and each of the Imahot our matriarchs and patriarchs, each of them has one particular midah, one particular attribute that was considered their midah, their attribute. So we know that Avraham, Yitzchak and Yaakov stood for 3 attributes. And we're going to see exactly why Avraham was what we're told that he is. So everyone famously will tell you that Abraham was known for, non-rhetorical question, chesed, kindness, hospitality, the tent with 4 doors, a door for open at all sides. He was the ish chesed, the person who taught us what true chesed, true kindness, true charity really is. But one thing that we have to know also in Torah is nothing that is written in the Torah is for no reason. And if the Torah goes out of its way to describe different attributes and different stories that bring out different messages about our avot and imahot, then it's to teach us something. But more than that, everything in the Torah is rooted in something deep. When we sit in kollel and in the yeshivot, and people sit for years and years and they're learning, I get asked this the whole time. What are you doing all day? What is this learning all about? Pick up a book, figure out the law, and go and live. What do you need to study and this and that? What are you doing all day? And there's something amazing. I'll give you an example. We're learning now in the mornings in a kollel I study in. We're learning Hilchot Shabbat. You think, hey, Hilchot Shabbat, it's a little bit complicated, technical, 39 malachot. Okay, so we're learning about a particular malacha, one of the malachot, one of the acts, creative acts that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. But one thing you have to know as an introduction to this idea, that if we're told that there is one thing, a particular malacha, that is not allowed to be done on Shabbat, and we're told that this is also forbidden and this is also forbidden, but it comes under the same umbrella, you have to know that those 3 or 4 concepts that are under the same umbrella are rooted in the same point. They come from the same root. And what you do when you're trying to understand, think about it. The halachot of Shabbat were given thousands of years ago. And they're applicable today as they were then. Which means you couldn't just give halachot. You couldn't just give laws. You had to give principles. And the halakha that we're taught are in principles. Which means you have to boil it down to its finest detail. To understand the deepest root, a principle, what exactly does this mean? So in the same way that we do that in halakha, we're going to do that with Torah. We're going to look at the attributes of our matriarchs and patriarchs and try and figure out what is the root attribute. And I'll tell you why it's confusing. If you ask, what is the attribute of Avraham? As you all said, chesed. But what is the first story that every single one of us learnt about Avraham? What do we all learn about? The idols. There was this cute little boy called Abraham. He was 3 years old, and his daddy said, "Oh, Abraham, I'm going out, with my mates. Can you look after the shop?" And Abraham goes and he smashes all, he didn't believe in the idols and he believed in God. We'll get to that in a second. So he decided he's going to teach his father an interesting lesson. He goes and he smashes all of the idols, apart from one, the big one, and he takes the hammer and he puts it in the big idol's hand, and his father comes home and he says, "Oh my, what happened? Who did this?" And Abraham says, "Daddy, it was him." And he points to the big idol. And Terach says, "Avraham, you think I'm stupid? You think I believe that idol can do that?" And Avraham turns around to his father and he says, "If he can't do anything, why would you worship him? How can you think that he is a God?" That's the first thing we learn about Avraham. More than that, so you'll say that's a midrash. The Torah itself refers to Avraham as a few particular names. One of the names that he's referred to, this is commonly a question I ask my students in school, because embarrassingly most of us don't know. Why is the language that we speak called Hebrew? In Hebrew it's called Ivrit. So we're told, and I would say unfortunately in the schools that I teach in, probably about 99.9999% of the kids don't know this answer, and unfortunately many adults do, but we're called the Hebrews. It's called Ivrit because Avraham is referred to by Hashem in the Torah as Avraham HaIvri. And Rashi tells us b'makom on the spot that what does HaIvri mean? It means from me'ever. Ever means from the other side. Why? Because the Torah tells us that the entire world that Abraham knew, the entire world that surrounded him, believed in idols and many different gods. And Abraham, despite the fact that the entire world stood on one side, he stood me'ever, on the other side. So midah of Abraham was that when the entire world believed in one thing, he believed in another. More than that, we're told, the Rambam points out, how did Abraham, this 3-year-old boy, discover God? We have some of the most intelligent minds in the world today that struggle with this concept. And yet a 3-year-old just figured it out. How did he figure it out? So the Rambam tells us, well, he looked around. And he said, well, it doesn't make sense. Something couldn't just come from nothing. That doesn't make sense. So who is the most powerful? Where did it come from? Oh, maybe it's the sun. It seems quite powerful, but the sun doesn't shine at night. Maybe it's the moon. No, but then, and he goes through what we would today call the cause and effect argument, the first cause. So Abraham at 3 years old looked out into the world and saw one thing after another. And that became, he was the one who brought monotheism back to the world. He was the ultimate ma'amin, the ultimate believer, the one who had emunah when everyone around him didn't. And yet, all of us know of Abraham as being ish chesed, the one who had ultimate concept of what charity and kindness means. So what we want to try and understand is if the Torah is going out of its way to tell us that Abraham possessed these two different attributes, on the one hand being ish chesed, hospitality, we learn from Avraham Avinu, but on the other hand, he was the one who rediscovered God in the world. It cannot be that these two midot, these two attributes, are not linked deeply. So what I want to try and do tonight is understand perhaps a little bit deeper what chesed, kindness or charity really means, and what this concept of Avraham HaIvri or emunah, or believing in God and being the one who rediscovered God, what does that mean, and how are these two things related? So we'll start with the idea of chesed. Now chesed, if you were to ask anyone really to translate the word chesed, they'd probably say kindness, good deed, loosely maybe people would say charity. But Rav Wolbe, who was the mashgiach of a yeshiva called Be'er Yaakov in Eretz Yisrael, who passed away about 15 years ago or so, told us that actually that's not what chesed means. Chesed, what we think is kindness, he says is something very, very different to what you and I think. If I were to ask you, give me a classic example of chesed, so you'd say, crossing an old lady across the street, giving £1 to a person begging for food. Rav Wolbe says, no. You've got it wrong. He says, if you walk past a person in the street who is begging for food, now, put all your excuses aside a minute. Pretend for a minute you know he is genuinely hungry, because we all know the first thing that goes through our minds, if I give him £1, he's going to spend it on drugs, right? So he's not on drugs. He's genuinely hungry. He genuinely wants food. And today, yes, you can afford that £1. You'll survive without your Diet Coke at lunchtime. So you have £1 that you can give him, and he genuinely, honestly needs it to buy food. Says Rav Wolbe, if you walk past and you give him that money, he says that's not called chesed. That's called derech eretz. He says if you don't give that person £1, you're not human. How can you see someone starving, have the ability to help and not help? So that's not chesed. That's simple derech eretz. What we want all of us to think that we have and we would love for our children to have. Derech eretz. So what is chesed? So I'll tell you a story. Happened when I was living in Israel. We, Baruch Hashem, we had our second child. Funnily enough, he's called Avraham. And I called him stubborn. My wife called him strong-willed. Whichever one you like to call it. But Baruch Hashem, he had a pair of lungs. And when he was upset about something, you'd hear about it. He would scream the house down. And he discovered a very exciting, at least for him, a very exciting game. He discovered that if he would wake up in the night take his dummy out, throw it across the room. When you hear that, Mummy or Daddy will get up out of bed and give you your dummy. He thought it was quite entertaining. So every night, we'd wake up to the sound of a screaming child because his dummy had fallen out of his cot. It took us a couple of weeks to figure out he was actually doing it on purpose. So we had a little bit of a discussion as to how we would deal with the situation. And I said, we can't go on like this. I said, it's like we're being manipulated by a 2-year-old. Come on. And he said, yeah, but you can't just let him cry. And I said, well, let's see how it goes. So, unfortunately for my neighbours, we decided, in Israel you live in a block of flats and everyone can hear everything. But worse than that, it was actually Sukkot. And unfortunately for one of my neighbours, his sukkah was 5 stories down over the window of my son, Avraham. So one night, on Sukkot, 5 flights down, this man is woken at 3 o'clock in the morning by a screaming child. Okay, it happens. The parents will come in a minute, in 3 minutes, in 5 minutes. What is going on? After about 10 minutes of my son screaming, we get possibly the worst thing you'd want at that time of night. Angry neighbor coming to complain. Now you think, I'm just trying to be mechanech my child. I'm trying to butt out. Anyway, so I go to the door, I look through the keyhole, and sure enough, it's my normally very nice, very happy, very religious neighbor called Rav Sternbach. Not the Rav Sternbach, his son. I look through, it's so not like him to, come and complain. So I do what anyone would do. I pretended I didn't hear the knock. And I went to deal with my child. I gave him his dummy. I put him back to bed and I went to bed. The next morning I go to shul. I'm coming back from Shacharit and I'm walking through the lobby and I'm faced by my neighbor. So I, try and avoid the looks, and he goes, Rabbi Yitzchok, which is the Ashkenazi way of saying Yitzi. So I said, yes. So he says, Ma kara etmol balayla? What happened last night? So I said, what do you mean? So he said, your baby was crying and screaming. I said, yeah, I know. He says, but I came knocking on your door. I was like, really? No, I didn't know. So he said, I was knocking. I'm like, yeah, he wanted to knock my lights out. I didn't say that to him, but I was thinking it. He said, why I was knocking? I said, no. He said, let me tell you something. He says, 2 nights ago, when it was Chag, he said, my grandchild was staying in my house. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, he awoke with a burning fever. He says, and we tried cold compression, this and that, whatever we could, and we were looking around frantically in our home, and we ran out of medicine. He says, it's 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. He says, I'm not going to go knocking on the neighbors. He says, but after my grandchild is screaming in pain, you have to do something. He said, I had no choice. I went to my brother, he said, lives just down the road. And I had no choice. I woke him up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I got medicine for my grandchild. Listen to this. So when I was awoken at 3 a.m. by a screaming child, and after 2 or 3 minutes, I heard that you couldn't calm him, I came to see if you need medicine. Now let me put this into perspective. He's a Rov. He's not going to climb and come to my house in his pajamas. He got up at 3 in the morning in his sukkah, got dressed, climbed 5 flights of stairs, went to his house, got medicine, and came knocking on my door. Yes, I felt about this big. But I'll tell you something phenomenal. Even when it's your own child, never mind someone else's. When you're woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning by a screaming child, the only thing you're thinking is, can someone shut that kid up? And the first thing that ran through his mind was there's someone who needs help. That, says Rav Olber, is chesed. There was a story years ago in Manhattan of a man who was on his way. He was a busy businessman in the streets of Manhattan. On his way for his lunch break, he's going down the road to the pizza shop, the kosher pizza shop down the road. And as he's walking down the road, he sees someone rummaging through the rubbish. Now, unfortunately, it's a sight anyone who works in town, you'll know, unfortunately, you see it quite often. And sometimes we're so busy, we're rushing, maybe we'll catch a glimpse, we'll feel sorry for a second, we'll run along on our way. Sometimes we'll feel like doing a good thing and we'll give them some money. This man, he said he doesn't know what came over him, but that day he saw this guy rummaging through the rubbish and his heart just went out to him. So he walks up to the guy and he says, "Excuse me, sir, can I buy you lunch?" And the homeless guy turns and he's like, "Talking to me?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "You know what? Actually, I'm going for lunch myself. Why don't you join me?" This guy's like, "It's not nice to make fun, man. You know, like, you're not going to take..." The guy said, "No, I'm serious. Please. I'd love for you to be my guest." Now imagine for a minute, just put this into perspective. Imagine walking in to Soyo on Golders Green Road with a tramp. Imagine the messages that are going to go around the community. Has she lost her mind? Who walks into a kosher restaurant with a homeless guy? But he says, "You know what? Don't worry. I'm going to put all that aside for the minute. This guy needs help." So he takes him to lunch. He sits down. He says to the guy, "Order whatever you want." This guy doesn't know if he's joking. After he sees he's serious. So he orders a pizza. The guy says, "Come on, you must be starving. Order something else." So he orders a salad. He says, "Why don't you get a milkshake?" And he buys the guy whatever he wants. And they start talking. And the businessman realizes this guy, you know, once you start talking, he's a normal human being. So he says, "You know what? You look like you've not changed your clothes in I don't know how long. You could probably do with a shower." He says, "Why don't you come back with me to my office?" He says, "We have a shower, because there's a gym over there. I have a change of clothes. And, you know, why don't you have a shower and get changed?" This guy says, "No, I don't want to." The businessman insists. So he takes him back to his office. The guy has a shower. He puts on the guy's gym clothes. Now he's sitting across from this businessman, looking much more human. And the businessman looks at him. He says, "Can I ask you something?" He says, "You look like a normal guy." He says, "What happened?" And the guy says, "Well, the truth is, I used to be a normal guy. I used to be just like you. I had a business, I had a family, I had a life." He says, "But one day, someone called me and promised me the deal of the century. And he told me he's going to make me a millionaire. And I invested everything I had. And the deal went sour." He said, "I lost it all. Everything." So the guy said, "You know, that's terrible." He said, "How did your family react?" He says, "I couldn't face them, so I didn't." I said, "What do you mean you didn't?" He says, "I couldn't face going home, so I didn't." He says, "You didn't call?" He says, "I haven't spoken or seen my family in over a year." The guy says, "Are you crazy? They're probably worried sick. They're probably wondering where you are." He says, "No, they're probably glad to have got rid of me. If they would have heard the story, they would..." He says, "Are you mad?" He says, "They're probably worried sick. Come on, let's call them." And he says, "No, I can't. I can't face them." He says, "Come on, let's call them. Let's..." And back and forth and back and forth. Eventually he convinces this guy to call his wife, who he'd not spoken to in over a year. She picks up the phone. She hears his voice. She breaks into tears. "Where are you? Where were you? We've been worried sick." The businessman gets straight in his car and reunites this guy with his family. Why? How? Because just for a second, he looked at someone else and saw a need and saw a human. And he took a second to take a break from his busy world and notice the people around him. Rav Wolbe says, the definition of chesed is not an act of kindness. Because chesed is not an act, it's a mindset. Giving someone a pound is derech eretz. He says, but looking beyond yourself and seeing the need of another human being, that's chesed. That was Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was not someone who just, when he saw someone needed something, or he was the door that you always knock on. He was someone that went out pursuing chesed, looking for it wherever he could. So much so, at the end of this week's parasha, we know Parashat Lech Lecha, he, at the very old age, does the mitzvah of Brit Milah. And at the beginning of next week's parasha, we're told that Avraham is sitting there, and Hashem himself comes to visit Avraham. This is the highest of highs, the greatest level anyone could ever reach. We learn from here, we're told, the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, of visiting the sick. Because Hashem himself, so to speak, the Shekhinah, came down and visited Avraham Avinu. Now Avraham is sitting there, having been visited by God. He is a man who from the age of 3 years old, the Rambam tells us, till the age of 75, which is where we meet him in this week's parasha, is someone who did nothing other than look for God in the world and teach that to the masses. His entire life he dedicated to searching for God and building that relationship. And finally he gets to the ultimate, the climax. He's sitting with God, a level that no other human will ever reach. And what happens? Hashem sees that Abraham's in pain. Why? Not because he had an operation at 99 years old 3 days beforehand. Not because that is the most painful day after Brit Milah. But because he wasn't able to do chesed. Hashem so much wanted to protect Avraham that he made that day a chamsin, a boiling hot day, so there would be no one in the desert, no one walking around, so that Avraham would not have to get up and do chesed. And Hashem comes to visit him, and he sees that the pain that Avraham is feeling is not the pain of his physical operation, but the deep pain of not being able to help. So Hashem has an idea. He sends 3 angels dressed as Arabs, Bedouins, people wandering through the desert. And Avraham sees these people. Now the Gemara points out something amazing over here. The Gemara says, Avraham Avinu was standing there, sitting there with God. The highest possible level that any Jew could ever achieve. Imagine, lahavdil, 1,000 times to make a difference. But imagine for a minute, the Queen came to your house. And you're entertaining the Queen with your best china, with a lovely cup of tea and some crumpets. And in the middle of you entertaining the Queen, there's a mashulach at the door. Someone collecting money. Would anyone in their right mind say, "Excuse me, Your Majesty, I just have to tend to this person," and then not only go over there, but start making them an entire meal while the Queen is waiting for you in your living room? Have you lost your mind? And yet Avraham Avinu says, Hashem, I'm really sorry. Can you just wait? I just need to tend to these random people wandering through the desert. Interestingly, the Gemara says from this, we learn from here that greater is the act of hachnasat orchim, of welcoming guests, than even being mekabel pnei shechina, welcoming the Shekhinah, God's presence itself. Rav Noach Weinberg Zatzal, the founder of Aish HaTorah, used to always say, you see from here a fundamental principle of Judaism. He says, we all get it wrong. He says, you think that Judaism is all about reaching these spiritual highs and connecting to God and sitting on some mountain in Tibet meditating for 24 hours a day. He says Judaism isn't about being with God. Judaism's about being like God. And nothing gave HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, more nachat, more satisfaction than to see his child leaving his own presence to go and help other people. So chesed is not just something cute that we do. Chesed is a mindset. It's something that we have to train ourselves in. We are unfortunately naturally very selfish or subjective human beings. We work on ourselves. Baruch Hashem, we're very good people sitting in this room. But generally speaking, the way that you're born, your nature is to be selfish. Survival of the fittest. You have to look after yourself first. And unfortunately, if we don't work on that, and sometimes even when we do, we live our entire lives in this totally subjective world. We are 100% blinkered. And therefore we fail to see the needs of people around us. We're so busy worrying about what we need that we forget about others. Chesed is a mindset. It's a mind shift. You can't just be how you've trained to be and think about yourself. You have to think about other people. That is chesed. And Avraham Avinu was the Baal Chesed par excellence. He was the one that taught us, that put inside every single one of us, in the same way that we are Ivrim, we are the Hebrews, we are people that even if the entire world tells us that this is okay, and we know it's not, Avraham Avinu instilled in every single one of us the power to stand up and say, this is wrong. And we know what's right. And just because the entire world is doing it, doesn't mean we're going to follow suit. That's what it means to be Avraham HaIvri. That's what it means to be Avraham, who went out and discovered his own father worshipped idols. The entire world that he knew told him that monotheism is a ridiculous concept. And yet he went out and taught the world monotheism. So that's chesed. But what is this other midah? This other attribute of Avraham, that he was able to go out and change the world, was able to go out and discover God and teach it to people. So someone sent me a very nice video the other day of a man who went around a university campus. Sounds like just from the accent, it was in Australia or somewhere. And he goes around interviewing random students. And he's asking all these students, can I ask you a question? Are you an atheist? They'll say yes. Are you an atheist? Yes. Are you an atheist? And he meets many acclaimed atheists. And he says, okay, thank you. He says, can I ask you something? And he gives them a book with beautiful pictures in it. He said, you see this book? Yeah, it's beautiful, right? Beautiful. He said, if I told you that some paint magically flew from the sky and landed on this book and created that picture, and then some black ink flew from the sky and magically landed on that page and formed every single word, every sentence, every paragraph in this book, what would you say? And everyone unanimously agrees, you're crazy. If you think that could happen, you're crazy. So he says, let me ask you something. You looked around the world, right? Have you ever heard of DNA? Yeah, heard of DNA. Now, you understand what DNA is, right? Yes, you understand. Your DNA dictates what you're going to look like, and every little part of you, and every living being in this world. Now, if I told you that that just came out of nothing, what would you tell me? And they smile, because they realize it's crazy. No, well, it evolved, right? So where did that come from? And slowly, each of these people, it wasn't a Jewish video, but each of these people are just realizing that something they've taken on that they assumed. It's amazing. He asks all of them, at what point in your life did you become an atheist and why? And they have the most interesting reason. Well, when I was 12, something happened to me, and I just thought, it just doesn't make sense. So since then, I don't believe in God. Another one says, well, when I was 15, and they all have these stories about some point in their life, something happened, they didn't really give it much thought, but you know what? I decided to be an atheist. And they all say, but you've got your reasons, but don't worry, I've got Richard Dawkins. I don't understand it, but he understands, and he told me that you God people are crazy. So it's funny, he says to them, well, if I were to tell you that Richard Dawkins believes that something can come from nothing, what would you say? That's crazy. He never said that. It's crazy, right? To say that something, the existence, physically, could come from absolutely nothing, what would you say? They say, well, obviously he would never say that because that's crazy. And then he shows them all a clip where Richard Dawkins is arguing with a priest on national TV, and they turn around and Richard Dawkins actually says, yeah, well, and they say, well, where did that come from? And where did that come from? He says, well, eventually something came from nothing. And the audience laughs. And Richard Dawkins is stumped. He's never been laughed at in his life. And he turns around and he says, why is everyone laughing? And the priest turns around and says, because you just told everyone that something can come from nothing. He says, well, it depends what you call nothing. And the priest says, well, actually, that's even more humorous. You're trying to define nothing. So Avraham Avinu went around the world and he showed people how he discovered God. He looked out to the world and he realized that it can't come from nothing. There has to be something that caused everything. There has to be something that caused it all. It has to have all come from somewhere, and he discovered Hashem, he discovered God. And more than that, he discovered, our rabbis tell us, he discovered the entire Torah. He discovered every single law that was in the Torah. And how? Because he looked and he looked and he looked. And he said, it can't be that. And he looked further, and it can't be that. And he looked further. So the question is, how is that at all linked to chesed? And this is something that was bothering me. I wasn't really sure. It has to be that the two are connected. It has to be there's something that is the root midah, the actual one attribute that links these things together. The concept of what we're told at the end of next week's parasha, after Avraham Avinu is about to perform the ultimate test of sacrificing his beloved son Yitzchak, Hashem turns around and says, now I see, Yira Elokim Ata. You are a real God-fearing person. You have Yir'ah. Yir'ah, we loosely translate as fear, but really actually means awe. Someone who is in awe of Hashem is someone who lives with the understanding that Hashem is real, that He's there, He's here. And Abraham, after 10 tests, Hashem says to him, the only time in Torah, He calls an individual a Yira Elokim. He says, you, Abraham, I see, are a person who truly is in awe of Hashem. You have this midah of Yirat Shamayim, of Yirah. And through your Yirah, through your awe of Hashem, I see that is why you have emunah. You believe in God. You discovered monotheism. You went out and you taught Torah to the entire world. And at the same time, Avraham Avinu is ish chesed. The person who loves everyone is always looking out for other people. And then I saw it in Rav Wolbe, in the Alei Shor. He says something so simple but so profound, and it answered all the questions for me. He said we have this concept called Yir'ah, awe of Hashem, emunah, belief in Hashem, the knowledge that Hashem is always there. And you have something also called chesed or ahava. And he says this concept of ahava and love, which brings people to do chesed and see the needs of other people. He said the concept of yir'ah and ahava, of yir'ah and chesed, he says these two concepts, chadhu, are really one and the same. He says it's one midah, one attribute called ri'at zulato. Ri'at zulato means seeing outside of yourself, looking beyond yourself. He says because when a person who is brought up naturally subjective and focused only on their own needs, they can't look beyond themselves. He says, but as soon as you grow up and you step out of your world, you will notice two things. You will see other people and their needs, and you will see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You will see Hashem. So Avraham Avinu was Ish Chesed, the man of ultimate kindness, of ultimate charity and loving kindness. But he was also Ish Emunah, a Yira Elokim, someone who had natural fear and awe of Hashem, someone who looked out into the world and he saw there are people who have needs. And he looked out into the world and he realized it could not have come from nothing. It couldn't have just created itself. It had to come from somewhere. And therefore Avraham Avinu, the same person, with the same midah, the same attribute of Riyat Zulato, of looking beyond himself, became the ultimate ma'amin, the ultimate Yireh Hashem, the person who has awe of Hashem and sees Hashem's presence in the world, but at the same time and with the same character, became Ish Chesed, the forefather, our patriarch, who stands for Chesed, for being a person who teaches us, who put inside every single one of us the ability to be an Ivri, a Hebrew, someone who stands up against the entire world, a person who can stand up. And even when the entire world is telling you, oh, be an atheist, it doesn't make any sense to believe in God, we can turn around and say, are you crazy? You're calling me crazy? Avraham Avinu turned around to his own father, his entire family. This week's parasha, Lech Lecha, he left everything. Do you know what it is for an Ish Chesed, for someone who does nothing but kindness, to leave his home, to leave his elderly father? Our rabbis tell us that when a person has a midah, a particular attribute, Hashem tests them against their natural tendency. So Avraham, who is Ish Chesed, who only wants to do loving kindness, where is he going to be tested? Opposite to Chesed, Gevurah, strength. Next week, Yitzchak Avinu we learn about, is Gevurah. Avraham, the ultimate Baal Chesed, who does nothing but kindness and acts of, and sees and cares and loves every human being, is told to leave his elderly father. And then finally, after years of having a son from his wife Sarah, he's told, take that son that you love and kill him. Do you know what a test that was for Avraham? And it's only at that point that Hashem says, you know what? Chesed may have been your nature. Chesed may have been the way that I created you. A person who sees the needs of other people. But now that I see you're so willing to go against your teva, your absolute nature, and go to the absolute other extreme just because I said so, and you know that this is emet, this is truth, and this is a reality, now I see, says Hashem, that Yireh Elokim ata, that you are a true Yireh Elokim. Because if your chesed is only something that you do, kindness and good deeds, because it's nice and it's cute, and maybe that's how you're brought up. Baruch Hashem, I was blessed, I was brought up in a family from both sides who understood what chesed is all about. And every time someone may say to me, wow, you did such an amazing chesed, I said, I can't take credit for that. That's how I was brought up. That's what my mother showed me, my father, my grandparents. I was force-fed that from a very young age. That's my nature. You can't give, obviously you take credit, but you can't give someone so much credit for being the person they were created as. So finally, when Avraham goes completely against his teva, against his nature, to the extent that he's willing to do the total antithesis, the total opposite, and sacrifice his own son, at that point, Hashem says to him, now Avraham Avinu, you are Avraham Avinu, one of the Avot, one of the patriarchs, the forefather of the Jewish people, who stands for Yirah, who stands for Yirat Shamayim, seeing Hashem and being in awe of Hashem, and ultimately chesed, not kindness, but the ability to look beyond yourself and see the needs of other people. Thank you.